Hi, everyone. It's Barb Egan with Therapy Talks. And on today's show, we have Dr. Kevin Chapman from Kentucky, a clinical psychologist and expert in anxiety, OCD, and sports performance. Kevin specializes in cognitive behavioral therapy. So we unpack the relationship between thoughts, feelings, behaviors, what that looks like with treating OCD, anxiety, sports performance, how we use intrusive thoughts, rituals, how we break some of those patterns and replace them with healthier ways of coping. Well, Kevin, thank you so much for coming on today. So can you tell us, where you're at, where you practice, the areas you work in, and a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Kevin Chapman. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist, and I'm the founder and director of the Kentucky Center for Anxiety and Related Disorders. So I am housed in Louisville, Kentucky. So my areas of specialty tend to include all things anxiety disorders. So everything under the anxiety umbrella, social anxiety, panic, agoraphobia, specific phobias, OCD, trauma, things like that, but I also do sports performance as well. I was a two-sport athlete in college, so sports have always been important to me too. So I work with a lot of athletes. I'm a consultant for the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency, an organization called True Sport, where I do a lot of mental health advocacy and things like that, and education for athlete mental health too. So I do a lot of sports performance in addition to my clinical work too.
I'm so excited to hear more about, what you work in, how you started this center in Kentucky, and just that, again, that correlation of anxiety, mental performance, athletes, that sort of thing. So how'd you get into those areas?
Well, I think the main thing is, again, being an athlete, but also just being interested in abnormal behavior and clinical psychology in general. When I was an undergraduate, the Cliff Notes version is that when I studied my first abnormal psychology course, it was intriguing to me that more people had anxiety disorders than anything else, yet
Hmm.
only a third received treatment, and yet they're very treatable. So as an athlete, it was always a challenge to me to, pursue something that kind of has low hanging fruit for a challenge, but also to be an answer to, someone's problem that they may have. So as I started studying clinically, I was really intrigued by the notion that anxiety disorders, is the area that I would really like to focus on more than anything else. And then, of course, being an athlete as well, it became pretty obvious as well that performance anxiety and social anxiety specifically are something that most people struggle with in some capacity, and it's a very normal experience for most
Mhm.
people. So ultimately, I pursued, well, what area did I want to make a niche, so to speak, and
Right.
I found that anxiety disorders were the things that I liked a lot. And I was really intrigued by phobias quite a
Yeah.
bit because growing up, I noticed a lot of people were afraid of certain animals like dogs and whatnot.
Yeah.
And it was always intriguing to me why that was the case. And of course, when I found out that that's an anxiety disorder, I was like, oh, I'd like to try to write about that and find some solutions. So,
Yeah. I love it. I know when people ask me, like, what do you like to work in? And like, I love anxiety.
mhm,
It sounds
mhm,
kind of weird saying, like, I love working in anxiety because I know it so well personally, just as
right.
a human being. And that's what we see the most of. But also as an athlete, like it just popped up
hmm
everywhere. And it's a two-sided coin of nerves and excitement, or that it could push you to focus and be motivated. But it's that fine line of when it inhibits your daily functioning and living and quality of
Yep.
life. So when you said it's very treatable, I want to start there because if we can kind of paint it with a lens of hope, tell us about that you saw, anxiety is quite prevalent. You're seeing a lot of people having, coming into therapy with this or presenting with it, but it's quite treatable. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, for sure. So, really, what we find with anxiety and related disorders is that you have what's called the first line treatment. And the first line treatment for most any mental health condition, of course, is medication. So, psychotropic medication tends to be the first thing that people try, right, to try to alleviate symptoms of distress and whatnot. But the gold standard treatment for anxiety and related disorders is what we call cognitive behavioral therapy. It's the
Mm,
most robust evidence-based treatment approach for all things, and I do mean all things anxiety. So ultimately, it's a very, simple to understand approach in terms of the relationship between how your thoughts influence your feelings or physiological arousal and your behavior. But it's a very conceptually solid and sophisticated approach as well, because you really need to understand the underpinnings as to how learned associations develop, and knowing that your brain is very malleable, that you can reprogram these learned fear associations that people have. So ultimately, cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, is time limited, it's evidence based, and it's very collaborative, unlike many other approaches. So,
Right.
that's something that's attractive anyway, right? Somebody who's an athlete or a people person, because ultimately you're not saying take 2 of these and call me in the morning. You're saying,
Right.
how can we join together, set an agenda every session, knowing that I know the ingredients that you need, but you are the expert of yourself. But if we collaborate in a very structured way, we can help you confront or approach the things that have been inhibiting your performance if you're an athlete, or things that have been inhibiting your performance as a person in life, right? So to speak,
Right.
like giving a speech, or having symptoms of claustrophobia, or not being able to go to the vacation because I'm afraid of air travel, or having symptoms of intrusive thoughts in the case of OCD. Like, all of those things are very treatable conditions if you do it in a very structured and evidence-based way, which CBT lends itself to.
Yes. And I'm a big fan of CBT. That's probably my most used approach. Can you give an example of CBT in real life with anxiety that you work in?
Sure, I'll speak to say social anxiety is a really good example, honestly. So let's say somebody has social anxiety. Well, regardless of the type of social anxiety it may manifest, but let's use a pretty common example. Say someone comes in clinically and they struggle with meeting new people, initiating or maintaining conversations, public speaking, which is the number one fear in the United States, by the way. Doing something that requires them to interact with others. The fear there, of course, is this persistent fear of negative evaluation. Other people's are going to make fun of me. I'm going to do something embarrassing or foolish. So when we know that people struggle with social anxiety, despite their cultural experiences, which is very relevant, despite other things that may occur, the thing is that if we know that the negative evaluation is the main concern they have, and their main coping mechanism, of course, is avoidance, then we know there's certain ingredients that are going to work for that person, right? Again, there's cultural variation in how you apply that, another conversation, but nonetheless, it's important. But from a general standpoint, I think ultimately we know that there's several ingredients that are necessary. Number one, we're going to have to do some psychoeducation. I always tell people that I need to teach you to be your own psychologist. So it's important that you understand that social anxiety is a normal part of life. We also need to get you to understand how your values are important, and how has social anxiety negatively impacted your specific values culturally, right? Religiously, et cetera, whatever it may be. It's important that we respect your values in that regard, but educate you that CBT is the gold standard approach. And it's something that if you're motivated, we can help you navigate. So psychoeducation is very important. So then we also teach, so homework is very important. So you're going to be engaging in homework strategies to read material related to CBT, read material related to social anxiety. So that's one very important ingredient, because most clients spend approximately 1% of their waking hours with you, meaning 99% of them are elsewhere. So homework is a very powerful treatment ingredient.
Right.
Secondly, cognitive restructuring is a very important component of social anxiety treatment. Teaching clients that the way that they interpret social situations is what creates the social anxiety, not the situation itself. And that's a game changer, honestly, because many people are like, well, when I go to that situation, this is what's going to happen. And like, it makes me anxious. Well, it triggers your anxiety, but that's a learned thinking process that can also be reprogrammed. So teaching clients, here's what I like to say, teaching you to treat your thoughts like hypotheses rather than facts is a really helpful way to help you navigate situations that are uncomfortable. And then finally, what we call exposure not only to the emotion of anxiety itself, but the situations that trigger it, is an essential ingredient. So we take the homework, we take the cognitive restructuring, which is one of my favorite things to do, along with exposure. And that in essence teaches you how to master your social anxiety.
Yes. And it's amazing because if we kind of equate it to, an athlete or just someone who likes exercise, we know that's good for us. The brain is like a muscle. And what I'm hearing you say, and what I love about cognitive behavioral therapy, is that even if I've always done it, I don't always have to do it. the brain's like a muscle, and we can create these basically new neural pathways in our brain of new thinking patterns, new cognitive ways of thinking, or cognitive restructuring, to find that, okay, how I thought before wasn't necessarily fact. It was just really fueled by a feeling or a distorted way of thinking. And that's really hopeful. Again, this is really treatable. This is the gold standard of treatment for things like anxiety, stress, depression, changing negative ways of thinking. And that's really hopeful.
Yep. I totally agree. And I like how you said new neural pathways and whatnot, because that's very important, because many times people who struggle with anxiety, whether you're an athlete or not, we have this idea that I'm always going to be this way and nothing can change. And like, to instill hope is very powerful, something I'm very big on, because you absolutely can change, and your brain does literally function completely differently when you change your thinking patterns. And it's possible. I see it happen every day. And it's so encouraging to see people, what I call, Barb, the before and after shot, right? Like you see them when they're the before shot, and then you see the end of the movie. And that's why you remind yourself of why you do what you do.
Yes, yes. And you said homework. I love homework. And I think, again, back to the athlete, I like the training, I like the practice, the routine,
Reps.
that ownership. And that's such a good perspective to have. Is clients spend 1% of their time with you, 99%, they're out there on their own. We want to kind of empower them to be their own therapists. So what are some of those homework style ways of cognitive restructuring, or just in general thought records? Like, what do you give as homework?
Yeah, well, a lot of things. So on the one hand, I think you got to build a solid foundation. Think of a metaphor of a house. A house with a shaky foundation is going to crumble. So what's very important when you're doing any sort of CBT, especially for anxiety and related symptoms, is teaching clients to understand that all emotional experiences have three parts. That's a very simple foundation, but it's very important, because most people are under the assumption that most emotions have one part, and that's how you feel. So it's all about feelings. People even use the word incorrectly, right? I feel like you shouldn't have said that to me, Barb. That's not a feeling, right? But nonetheless, soapbox, but nonetheless, teaching a foundation to start being aware and monitoring when you have an emotional experience, whether it be anxiety or something else, putting it in its correct three components. It's essential for building a solid foundation in preparation for the more robust ingredients, right? So paying attention when I'm interacting in public, when I go to the supermarket or the grocery store and I feel that arousal in my body, labeling that and writing it out objectively. And I think, Barb, that's so important. The objective recording is essential, meaning you're writing features, not feelings, not feelings. It's not a diary. It's more so saying, can I pay attention to the right thing and put emotions in the right context? That's very important, because many people stay in their own head, and objective recording and monitoring forces you to think about yourself like an outsider would. So part of it is initially monitoring, well, what is this emotion to begin with? Beyond that is then doing homework related to things like, well, where did this social anxiety come from? Starting to piece together learning experiences that I had early in life. What were the messages my parents or caregivers taught me about how to interact with others? Or if it's generalized anxiety or worry, it's the same sort of concept. It's like, what sort of things was I taught growing up about emotions, and whether or not the stomach distress I have is threatening or not, and things like that. So monitoring that, and then coming up with a list of situations where I have these emotional experiences, coming up with a game plan or a hierarchy, if you will, and structuring that to reflect the situations that tend to trigger this distress that I have, so that we can collaboratively kind of knock them out of the park, if you will, to use a sports analogy. So, those are some of the examples of the homework assignments that you do, like monitoring thoughts, like you said, a thought record, that's important. Identifying triggers, the emotional response, how much you believe the thought, thinking errors, like how your thinking errors contribute to how you feel emotionally. And then, of course, the consequences of your emotional response is also a very important element.
Yes. And those thinking errors, or cognitive distortions that we call them in psychology, often I call them thinking traps, because you feel so trapped by them, and you can be trapped in anxiety or social anxiety, just feeling stuck. And my tendency, when I can kind of identify them, is when I'm using big words, definitive words. everybody. Nobody else deals with this.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody else has got it figured out.
Always happens to me. Yep.
Yes, never. And so if
Mm-hmm.
you're someone who thinks that way, that's a cognitive distortion. So pay attention to those big definitive words, starting to identify them, then we can challenge them and then we can replace them. What are some other thinking errors or cognitive distortions that you often see?
Yeah, so it's interesting you say that, Barb. So I like thinking traps as well. That's typically what I say. So, thinking traps, thinking errors, cognitive distortions, essentially irrational views that restrict your emotional experience. And though I like to collapse them into two main categories to simplify, like catastrophizing is a really big thinking trap. Like
Yeah.
you said, always or never, always, or all or nothing, black and white,
Yeah.
dichotomous thinking, but also, probability overestimation, which you could break down to an example. Fortune telling is an example of that. This idea that I'm making this negative prediction about the future. If I'm an athlete, I know I'm going to get struck. I'm going to strike out because of the drop change that, she's going to throw at me. Well, that's going to inhibit your performance. Or if I'm anxious about a situation clinically, I'm going to make a fool of myself, right?
Right.
So that's fortune telling. Mind reading is a big one, where we predict what people are going to think about us, right? They're going to think this outfit sucks, or they're going to think that, I don't have enough experience. Those are other examples. Labeling. I'm so stupid, right?
Yeah.
I can't believe I'm such an idiot, right? I look like a cow in this dress, like things like that. Like, so we shame ourselves.
Right.
Those will guarantee that I will have an intense emotional experience. That's the problem, Barb, is I don't tell people that it's wrong to think that way.
Right.
That's not the issue with thinking traps. The issue with thinking traps is that thinking traps restrict what emotions you're able to experience in a given situation. And therefore, sarcastically, it's okay that you say that you're going to do something stupid if you're okay feeling that way, but no one is.
Right.
So
right.
that's kind of
yeah. So let's say you're working with someone, you're helping them identify that these cognitive distortions or thinking traps are coming up. And let's say it's a fortune telling type one or mind reading, so and so doesn't like me, or back to that social anxiety, public speaking example. I said this in front of friends or at a meeting, or I spoke up in class. Nobody said anything back. They must think I'm an idiot. Oh, that was so
right.
dumb. Why did I do that? I'll never do that again. How do you work through that with someone then? So you identified that. Now what?
Yeah. So basically, the good thing about doing cognitive work with someone is that it requires you to be very sophisticated and delicate in the approach. You're not spoon feeding the client a way to get out of that way of thinking, because they're used to that anyway from people that care about them. For example, if someone's like, no one said a thing, I know they thought it was horrible. And then someone who cares about them naturally are going to say, oh, no, it wasn't. They probably were thinking about something else, blah, 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 blah. Logically, they know that, but that's not how it feels.
Right.
So you don't spoon feed clients when they have thinking traps. You in a very sophisticated way, Socratically ask them questions to get them to see something you already know. Let me give you a quick example, Barb.
Yes.
So again, play football. So it's like, suppose, and you are Ohio State, so you'll resonate with this. So it's like, suppose, a wide receiver catches the ball. He makes it to the 20. He makes it to the 15. He has one man to beat. He makes it to the 5. He gets hit in the leg by the safety, but he crosses the pylon with the ball. And the referee looks and throws his hands in the air. What's that called? Well, most people would know that's a touchdown. But notice I didn't tell you it was a touchdown.
Yes.
I ask you questions to get you to to see what I already knew in advance, right? So on the same token, if someone comes to me and they say, oh, no one said anything, that means that this presentation was lousy, then I would say something to the effect of, well, are you 100% sure that they thought the presentation was lousy? And they say, well, they didn't say anything. And then I'd probably say, well, does them not saying anything mean that your presentation was lousy? No, not necessarily, but I feel like it was. Oh, okay. So are you saying that this prediction is being driven by intense feelings? Well, I guess so. Okay. So if that's the case, what's another perspective or explanation as to why they didn't say anything? Right? Like, this is one of my favorite things, right, Barb? So at that point, they're like, okay, I see your point. And then you help them. Could it be fill in the blank of an alternative? Could it be fill in the blank of an alternative? Could it be? And then at that stage, they're saying, okay, so now I need to put on a new thought, what I often call a rational response or an alternative interpretation, right? Or alternative appraisal. There's a number of words we use for that. And they practice meditating on that thought and using it in these situations. And ultimately, they're collecting data that supports a new way of thinking instead of something that confirms that, this thought must be true. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yes. And I love that because we could just say, well, here's another way to think about it. But you're right. It doesn't stick then. It has to come from them, that aha moment or that light bulb going out for the client, that individual, because then it's going to really stick with them. They're going to start to believe it for sure once they start to test out that new belief or collect that data and start a little bit more rather than just saying, well, Kevin told me or Barb told me this, so I'm going to try to believe it. That usually doesn't work.
Correct. Yep. So that's how I walk somebody through that process, honestly.
Yes, absolutely. So good. What are some CBT resources that you use? Do you like books or podcasts, apps? What do you like to use?
I'd say that's a great question. Typically, what I would opt for is, what are the organizations where you could get some really credible information from as it relates to CBT? Because what I find, Barb, I'm kind of snobby when it comes to this because you find a lot of people say, I do CBT. And I always like to remind my clients, CBT is not something you do, right? It's a very strong, conceptually solid approach that requires more than just doing, like pulling a skill out here and there. It's something where you need to really know the research literature behind it and whatnot. So with that said, from a dissemination standpoint to people in the public, I always like to tell people, ADAA, so the American Association or the Anxiety and Depression Association of America, ADAA.org is a very, very good resource. The Association for Behavioral and Cognitive Therapies is one of my favorite, abct.org is a phenomenal resource. The International OCD Foundation, IOCDF.org is another phenomenal organization. So those are some really, really solid places to find some good resources for cognitive behavioral therapy. And the people who do or who are certified in it, you can find people that are certified in it as well, which I always like to talk to people about that too.
Yes, yes. What drew you to CBT when you were doing your training and saying, this is the type of work I want to do, this is the type of approach?
Well, two things. Number one, well, probably three, don't hold me to that, but I would say that it's the most robust with evidence. It works. Yeah. One of the hashtags we use all the time on social media is hashtag CBT works because it does. So again, it's the most evidence-based approach. So you know what you're getting. It's an effective approach that's not magical in any way. It works for people, right? So that's one thing. The second thing is that it's logical and easy to understand in terms of it's relatable to real life. It applies to anything you can consider, whether it be you're an athlete or someone who is annoyed or someone who doesn't like driving or someone who procrastinates. It applies to any emotional experience that you have. So the ingredients of it are really easy for us to understand on a day-to-day basis, literally for anybody. It's logical. It makes sense in that way. And I love that part. And the third piece, Barb, is that it's not spoon feeding. You're helping the client help themselves.
Yeah.
And that's very attractive to me. I wouldn't want anybody to say, all right, well, just do this, right? When you haven't really lived their experience. I think it does a really good job of taking each individual that you work with and getting them based on their values and such to see the logic or whatnot in how this will apply to their life circumstances on an individual basis. And that's really powerful and very attractive to most people.
Yes. Yeah. I think CBT is so personal. It's so personalized and so practical. And who doesn't want something like that to actually put in some practical, tangible steps in rather than that theory or based on feeling? Again, feelings are real. They're not always reality or concrete though. And so if we can have some homework or to start to be able to identify these automatic negative thoughts or these thinking errors that we have, then we get to move forward in that and start to challenge it, or even just your probability of saying, okay, out of 100%, do you believe that to be true? I love how you asked that earlier, just because you spoke up and nobody said anything, that thinking error, they hated it. Is that 100% true? When we put a number to it, and probably from the athlete background, I love numbers. I love objectivity. It helps me come down from like, okay, it's either on or off. And anxiety is not really like that. It's not like an on or off switch. It's more like that dimmer switch or a staircase that you can come down. So even if you believe that 80%, it's still high. It's not 100%. Doesn't mean it's absolute truth. There's some room to combat it then, or to offer that other perspective that maybe starts at a 10%. That, well, just because they didn't say anything doesn't mean they hated it. But maybe over time, like you said, the collecting of the data, it grows.
Yep.
And that person sits in a meeting, their colleague speaks up in a meeting, but that individual doesn't say anything back, but thinks to themselves, that was a good point. It doesn't really merit me to say anything. I agree.
Right.
They recognize, oh, that was one of the beliefs I had, the irrational beliefs. Now I'm seeing that it may have a rational place in here too.
So
and
incredibly true.
That's really powerful.
Yep. Totally agree.
When you're doing CBT or practicing CBT with clients, how often do you like to see them? What's the treatment plan time frame, or is it more unique?
That's a great question. Traditionally, depending on the nature of the symptoms, so generally speaking, I'd say weekly for 50 to 60 minutes, generally speaking. But when you start getting really specific, for example, and it's something that I'm publishing soon, Barb, so it's a really ironic question.
Ooh.
But depending on the nature of the phobia, I have a 1-session treatment for that, like an intensive treat. I have an intensive treatment approach here at the center, where we can see some clients who have certain phobias for one long extended session and do like brief boosters, like via virtual treatment. And then we have intensives for a week for panic phobias and agoraphobia as well, where we do several hours for 5 days during that week to get them clinically significant improvement. So even like for OCD and things like that, sometimes we see clients, multiple days a week, sometimes twice a week. We extend the variability of sessions from 60 to 90 minutes, depending on the nature of the problem. So that's another good thing about CBT, depending on the person, like you said, is that we could do traditional once a week, an hour block, right? Or we can do one long extended session if it's a phobia, a week-long intensive, and we do OCD treatment that could be multiple days a week as well.
When you're working with OCD, how does that differ from anxiety?
Yeah, so many people ask me that question. And I think that the main thing is that it's not that they're different per se. I like to tell people that anxiety is the primary emotional experience, and OCD is the byproduct or the manifestation based on that person's learning history, right? So in other words, anxiety is part of the core feature of OCD, but the difference in terms of the ingredients of treatment is still very cognitive, still very behavioral, but it's primarily behavioral in nature. Exposure is a very potent ingredient for OCD treatment, and confronting learned fear association is absolutely paramount with OCD. So one of the big differences there is that when you're dealing with intrusive thoughts, also known as obsessions, or compulsions, also known as rituals, you have to break and sever the relationship between the obsession leading to anxiety, because anxiety is a part of it, and then the ritual leading to temporary, keyword, relief, temporary relief. In order to do so, unlike many of the anxiety disorders we treat, with OCD, you hit the ground running a lot faster most times because it's so incredibly problematic and impairing to functioning. So whereas with somebody with, say, social anxiety or even panic, if they don't do an intensive, we tend to build through psychoeducation and monitoring, like you said, using thought records and whatnot. And then we get into the meat and potatoes of confronting things later, still short, but like session 6 or so, right? Hypothetically. But with OCD, not so much. You hit the ground running a whole lot faster when you're working with somebody with OCD. Typically like session 3, you're going to be confronting some uncomfortable things.
Can you give an example of what someone coming in with presenting with OCD, what that looks like, and what that treatment kind of progress and process looks like?
Yeah, well, with OCD, I'll give a non-stereotypical example because most people, of course, stereotype contamination. So I'd say one that's even equally common that I see personally is what we call harm obsessions, where you have this intrusive thought that either you're going to harm yourself. And again, it's an intrusive thought. It's not that I want to, it's the idea of what if I do, right? Accidentally.
The what if.
Oh, correct. Or I'm going to harm a loved one unintentionally. Case in point, I had a client yesterday, a new one, right, who came in and they said, I don't know what this is, but since I've had my baby recently, I've had these intrusive thoughts. They labeled it as intrusive thoughts. I had these intrusive thoughts of, what if I leave my baby in the bathtub and they drown and it's my fault? What if I clutch them too tight and kill them unintentionally, right? What if I leave the door open and my 3-year-old like strolls out and gets kidnapped? Like these are the sort of intrusive thoughts they have. And then they engage in rituals that give them temporary relief from that, whether it be checking locks on the door multiple times, whether it be saying a prayer multiple times, whether it be making sure there's certain things not left out, not making sure I don't have sharp objects around when I'm holding the baby, things like that. So, you do the psychoed part and get them to understand those associations that I just mentioned. Then you get them to start confronting those intrusive thoughts and the situations that trigger them without engaging in their rituals. So it all depends on what the person needs to learn, right? Is it that I need to learn that if I leave my 3-year-old out and pay attention to the idea that, if I leave them out, then that could lead to them getting a sharp object and killing themselves. They actually have to attenuate to that possibility and think about it, which is something they're avoiding. And what they find is two things. Number one, the feared outcome doesn't in fact occur. And number two, they can tolerate the distress associated with it potentially happening. Yeah. So when you do that enough times while severing that ritual, no prayer, right, for that, no checking, normal checking, no whatever it may be, then ultimately they learn that that association is no longer present. And therefore that thought is uncomfortable at times, but it's not something that is going to lead me to do something that's going to make me more distressed later.
Right. I can ride that uncomfortability or that distress wave.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Exactly.
That's great. I see so much of that with moms as well. That's a great example. Yes.
Yeah.
And to even label it as these are intrusive thoughts. It doesn't mean I want to do it. It's the what if I do this? And what does that mean about me? Because as humans, we want to make meaning or associate that thought or that belief with the meaning about ourselves or the world. And that can be really distressing too. And just fuel that fire.
Yep, exactly.
So when you're working with anxiety or OCD, how do you differentiate? Like what would some signs and symptoms be to separate them? Because there's some anxiety involved with OCD, but the intrusive thoughts, the compulsions, those rituals, how would you know that maybe this is more OCD than anxiety?
Well, I think that, Barb, you actually just said it. So I think when we're doing, first of all, clinical interviews are our guide. So since we have diagnostic criteria for all things anxiety disorders and OCD related disorders, I think that we know that there's certain criteria that's a bit different across everything we just mentioned. So with OCD, many people say, I get anxious about these thoughts, but the difference though is the quality. Intrusive thoughts can be thoughts, images, urges, or impulses that come into my mind when I'm trying to focus on something else. And the quality of those thoughts differ significantly from anxiety. And oftentimes with OCD, it's also true for anxiety. This is another podcast probably, but I will say that oftentimes with OCD, there's also a big problem with what we call thought action fusion. And thought action fusion is that the idea that the thought and the action carry the same weight. For example, the thought that if I leave my baby alone long enough, that's just as bad as me killing them, right? Like if I thought about putting my daughter's hand on the hot stove, then it's like I did it, right? So it's this idea that the thought and the action are fused, which makes you even more uncomfortable. And that's true with other types of anxiety, like chronic worry is an example, but it's much more prevalent and pervasive with OCD than it would be. And the intensity of that distress is going to be much higher. There's a sense of responsibility, right, attached to it. So that's the big thing, is the fact that there's intrusive thoughts. There's also the idea of rituals being present. And these rituals and intrusive thoughts take more than an hour per day. So when you start getting into those defining features of OCD, you see that it has a different quality and a different type of impairment than other anxiety-related disorders.
Right. Wow. Kevin, thank you for sharing so much on OCD and anxiety, sports performance, all of these areas that you work in. Is there anything else you want to share today, or where our listeners can find you, or any projects you're working on?
Sure. So they can find me. You can go to drkevinchapman.com. If you're a social media head, like many of us, you can find me on Instagram, Dr. Kevin Chapman, Twitter at Dr. K-Chap, which is my nickname. Or you can go to kycards.com. So those are places you can find me. And again, I think we're working on these intensive treatment approaches and have some media projects coming out pretty soon that we'll put on social media related to treatment of phobias and whatnot. So that'll be cool. So
Awesome. That's fantastic. Well, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your story and your expertise. We really appreciate it.
now, thank you. I appreciate it.
All right. Have a good one.